At an international conference on moral leadership, Elizabeth Harper rose to challenge William Bradley about his past controversy involving Emily Watson. She questioned why someone impeached for perjury was now instructing youth on ethical conduct. In a mere 5 minutes, her speech drove Bradley from the platform, igniting a nationwide uproar that divided the nation. Some labeled her impulsive. Millions hailed her as the sole voice courageous enough to end the quiet. So, what did Elizabeth articulate that remained unspoken for a quarter century? Remain with us. This tale demands every moment of your attention. An email landed at 2 a.m. titled Vision for Ethical Leadership. A Bradley Global Forum invite, the sort of glossy, PR-laden note her team typically ignored and filed away. Yet this one slipped through. It was flagged as urgent. Elizabeth Harper gazed at the illuminated monitor in her office's dimness, lit only by the screen's glow and the stark Chicago skyline outside. "We'd be privileged to welcome Congresswoman Harper to our keynote panel on ethical leadership," it stated, hosted by William Jefferson Bradley. She didn't waver, didn't flicker her eyes, but sat motionless, then silently reached for the drawer on her left, retrieved a worn manila folder, heavy with suppressed anger, and placed it deliberately on her desk. Within it, the complete 453-page Star report, Emily's testimony, details of the notorious stained dress, with handwritten notes from the summer Elizabeth worked at a women's advocacy group. She recalled how mentors murmured about the cost of ambition and how some names went unchallenged. She turned to the section where Bradley's denial captivated the nation. "I had no sexual relations with that woman." She mouthed the words softly, not in jest, but with a chilling edge, like someone honing a mental dagger. For many, the invite was a chance to gain visibility, to mingle with historical figures. For Elizabeth, it was entirely different. An arena, a snare, a trial by fire. She reclined in her chair, breathed out sharply through her nose, like a boxer before the opening blow, then grabbed her phone. Her aide picked up, voice thick with sleep. "Hello." Elizabeth's tone sliced through, smooth yet unyielding as tempered steel. "Confirm my attendance." "I'll go, and I won't hold back." Then she disconnected. In the quiet that ensued, she peered through the window, observing storm clouds amassing over Chicago's horizon. She wasn't there to honor a legacy. She was there to probe who shaped it. She wasn't there to posture or cheer. She was there to face the truth head-on. When Elizabeth Harper emerged from the black SUV into the radiant lobby of Boston's Grand Continental, cameras flashed like volleys of gunfire. Inside, the ballroom shimmered with influence and prestige. Senators, corporate leaders, scholars, and reporters, all assembled beneath chandeliers that had witnessed too much reticence. This was a Bradley Foundation event, refined, orchestrated, and meant to exalt legacies. Elizabeth glided through the throng like a tempest contained within crystal. Her aura disquieted some, captivated others, yet none suspected she bore in her bag the full burden of the past and the resolve to unleash it. William Bradley stepped onto the stage with his trademark smile, coaxing laughter from the crowd with a quip about aging and heritage. "Tonight, we have brilliant minds among us," he declared, motioning to the panel, including Congresswoman Elizabeth Harper, embodying the future of leadership. Soft clapping followed, courteous but faint. Elizabeth stood, composed, focused, but as she approached the microphone, the mood shifted instantly. Her voice was even, yet her words struck like lightning. "Before we discuss ethics moving forward," she stated, "let's address who defines morality and who evades its judgment." The room hushed. Bradley's grin faltered. And in that instant, the festivity transformed into a tribunal. The festivity had fractured, But now Elizabeth was set to cleave directly through its empty core. As her voice pierced the ballroom's gleaming stillness, the ambiance changed. It wasn't mere quiet. It was a void, dense with expectation and apprehension. Utensils hovered mid-motion, gazes flickered, uncertain whether to focus on her or him. Elizabeth stood unwavering. She held her ground under the harsh spotlights, a lone silhouette against the opulence surrounding her. Her tone was steady. Each word weighted, as if she'd rehearsed them countless times, not for practice, but to keep them etched in her memory. "Before we delve into policy," she declared, her voice clear and restrained, "before we trade niceties about ideals and aspirations, I must pose a question rooted not in politics, but in anguish." She surveyed the audience deliberately, not seeking affirmation, but demanding reckoning. "For years, women like me have been urged to let go, to be thankful the system functions, to allow power to atone on its own terms." She paused, her breathing controlled. "But can a man impeached for deceit under oath, a man who evaded, sidestepped, and shirked moral duty, truly stand here now and lecture my generation on what ethical leadership entails?" Her words didn't escalate. They burrowed, profound, like deliberate pebbles cast into a calm pond, sending ripples across every countenance. A soft gasp arose from the audience's left flank. A woman, perhaps in her mid-40s, averted her gaze. A young staffer shot a nervous glance at his superior. A journalist at the rear whispered, "My God," under her breath. The atmosphere was shifting. A revered aspect of this space, its compulsion to feign ignorance, was being dismantled. Then, at last, the man himself moved. William Bradley eased back in his seat, lips parting faintly, as if weighing the price of his reply. And then it came, breezy, practiced, meant to deflect. "That's quite an opener," he grinned, as if it were still 1998, as if charisma could obscure the past. But Elizabeth didn't return the smile. She didn't budge, didn't even flutter her eyelids, because in that moment, she wasn't after applause. She wasn't there to amuse. She was there to remind a room of survivors, allies, and complicit bystanders that the past doesn't vanish in quiet. It festers until someone dares to voice it aloud. The grin failed. Not this time. Not in this place. The room heard his sidestep. That's quite an opener. But it landed hollow, like a scripted line from a drama whose relevance had long expired. All attention remained on her, and Elizabeth stood firm. She didn't retort with irony or overt frustration. She moved with purpose, measured, reaching for the folder she'd carried, its corners frayed, its contents perilous. As she straightened, she clutched a single page between her fingers, like a honed weapon. Her voice was soft yet resolute, as if each word she was poised to utter had lingered, unseen, within the very walls of that ballroom. "They claim we shouldn't dredge up history," she said, her gaze encompassing everyone and no one. "But perhaps it resurfaces because we've never truly confronted it to begin with." She glanced at the paper and inhaled, not for herself, but for another. "Allow me to recall what it felt like when silence was imposed and blame was heaped on the vulnerable." Then she recited, "I was made to believe I alone bore the disgrace, as if I had lured a president, as if I had shattered a legacy." Her voice didn't waver, didn't tremble, but something in the room did. It was the bedrock of complacency, of denial, of a narrative built on omission. She was 22. Elizabeth pressed on, her eyes rising from the page. Fresh from college, she became a global jest, while the man she served, this man, continued authoring books, delivering speeches, and earning ovations in halls like this. Her tone grew sharper, yet restrained. She didn't need to shout. The truth carried its own volume. The press questioned her attire. Comedians cracked jokes. But no one pondered what it meant for a young intern to bear a nation's scandal, while its orchestrator crafted his legacy with accolades and grandeur. She halted, not for drama, but for composure. She set the paper on the podium, like evidence presented in a trial. I was warned against this, told I'd seem bitter, unpolished, that I'd make it too personal. But this is personal. For every woman instructed to erase her pain, to shrug it off, to move forward for someone else's ease. Her voice softened, but her stare remained unyielding. I'm not here to spoil anyone's night. I'm here because we've constructed institutions on silence, and I'm weary of equating silence with harmony. The room's air was no longer merely taut. It was charged, raw, authentic. Elizabeth hadn't just exposed the wound. She compelled the entire room to confront it, to name it, to recall who inflicted it. She wasn't grasping for a microphone. She was reaching for fairness, and she did so in the one venue where it had always been withheld. The atmosphere had changed. He sensed it, and so did she. But men like William Bradley don't yield. They pivot. They draw on the rhetoric that shielded them before, the well-worn playbook of remorse, reflection, and artfully packaged atonement. He adjusted the microphone with the ease of a veteran of countless podiums. His voice was calm, infused with experience, finesse, and calculation. I've faced the consequences, he started, his tone subdued, as if inviting the crowd to share his fatigue. I've erred, I've contemplated, I've grown, and I sincerely believe the American public has pardoned me. A few courteous nods rippled through the front row. He wasn't begging, he was performing, a performance he'd mastered. I believe this country thrives on second chances, he added, sweeping his gaze across the room like a sage, reminding his kin of mercy. I owned my faults and pressed forward. But Elizabeth wasn't there for the spectacle. She didn't nod, didn't relent. She took a single step forward, and her words, though quiet, were shattering. Pardon, she said, locking eyes with him, isn't the same as oblivion, and silence isn't synonymous with absolution. Her voice didn't climb, it anchored, rooted in a truth too long overlooked. You claim you paid a price, but what was that price precisely? A fleeting dip in public favor? Enduring harsh news cycles while dwelling in opulence? Speaking on platforms like this, where the only true penalty is a tough question you didn't anticipate? She didn't blink. The burden wasn't yours to carry. It was hers. It was every woman told to dismiss her trauma, to conceal her shame, so a man could preserve his legacy unscathed. She glanced briefly at the crowd, not to seek their endorsement, but to hold them answerable too. You gained a library, she said. She was reduced to a punchline. You secured book contracts and foundations. She got a name smeared on late-night shows. Her tone didn't falter. It deepened. And whenever someone like me raises this, you call it stale news, saying we've moved on. But who is we? She leaned slightly forward, her final question a precision blade. Did you genuinely learn from your error, Mr. President, or did you merely master surviving it? The silence that followed wasn't hollow. It resonated with the sound of a legend crumbling in real time. The silence after Elizabeth's last question didn't merely linger. It hung like fog that refused to lift. For a moment, it seemed Bradley might not respond. His jaw tensed, his fingers grazed the podium once, then again. But old patterns persist, especially for men who've spent decades turning disgrace into a footnote and criticism into a claim. He exhaled deliberately, then leaned forward, with the poised demeanor of one who'd weathered tempests and always made the storm seem like progress. I hear you, Congresswoman, he said, his voice steady but calculated, each word a strategic move. I respect your fervor, but I hope you'll acknowledge the reality that this nation is built on dialogue, not just confrontation. He lifted his gaze to the audience, not solely to her. Yes, I've faltered personally. Yes, I've expressed regret. And yes, I've borne the repercussions. But as we revisit history, I urge you all not to overlook the broader record. His voice grew firmer, his assurance returning. Under my leadership, America enjoyed its longest stretch of peacetime economic growth. 22 million jobs, a balanced budget, unprecedented investments in education, healthcare, and innovation. Crime dropped, home ownership soared, we lifted millions from poverty. A few heads nodded, some from conviction, others from reflex. He knew the cadence. He knew how to craft his defense, not through denial, but through legacy. I'm not seeking exemption, he said, raising a hand to forestall critique. I'm asking for balance. Leaders are human, imperfect, and if we judge them only by their lowest moments, we risk erasing the advancements their leadership achieved. He turned slightly toward Elizabeth again. We can't keep dismantling everyone who's stumbled, or soon no one will remain standing. There was a pause, not silence this time, but something vaguer. Disquiet. The murmur of people questioning whether that rhetoric still held sway, whether it suited the moment. For while Bradley leaned on what he contributed to America, Elizabeth stood as a reminder of what was taken and never restored. But Elizabeth didn't waver, not when he cited jobs or budgets or legacy, because she'd heard it all before. So had every woman told that results outweigh repercussions, that a man's achievements render the lies, the silence, the harm mere collateral noise. She let the pause extend, the tension tighten, before advancing with a voice so composed it carried a warning. We're exhausted, she said deliberately. Exhausted by a culture that trades silence for success. Exhausted by the notion that building bridges or balancing ledgers grants immunity from answerability. She wasn't shouting. She didn't need to. Her words didn't detonate. They landed, one by one, like judgments. For decades, we've seen powerful men lauded for their creations, while those they wounded were told to hush for the greater good. She scanned the room, not for theatrics, but for justice. You say your presidency elevated millions. Perhaps it did, but it also taught a generation of young women that if a powerful man wronged them, they should stay silent. That speaking out would cost their careers, their reputations, their dignity. That they'd be ridiculed, mocked, turned into late-night fodder, while the man who shamed them remained Mr. President's forever. Her voice grew keener, not louder, but icier. Emily Watson wasn't a singular case. She was merely the one who couldn't be concealed. But I've spoken with others, women who abandoned politics before starting, women who changed paths after seeing what happens when you confront the wrong person at the wrong moment, women who never stepped into the fray at all. She inhaled, not from fatigue, but to let the room catch up. You say we shouldn't erase the good. I'm not attempting to. But I won't let the good erase the suffering either, because when we wield legacy as a shield, we teach the next generation that ethics are optional, as long as your credentials shine brightly enough. She stepped back slightly, but her gaze held steady. How many lives do we offer up to ambition's altar before we question what leadership truly means? The room stayed still, because in that instant, it was evident she wasn't addressing one man anymore. She was addressing a system, one that had permitted too much to slide, one long overdue for scrutiny. But Elizabeth wasn't done, far from it. Words had revealed the fissures, but what followed broke the room apart. She paused, her silence more resonant than any ovation. Then calmly she tapped her tablet. A faint chime rang through the ballroom, as the massive screen behind her sprang to life. The audience stirred, uncertain. "We've heard much tonight about progress," she said softly. "About advancement, about lessons absorbed. But progress requires truth, and truth doesn't fade just because it unsettles people." The screen went dark for a moment. Then gradually, a video materialized. The scene was stark. Emily Watson, seated in a simple chair, facing the camera. No cosmetics, no staging, just candor. Her voice, through the speakers, was weary but resolute, heavy yet firm. They advised me, kindly but firmly, to refrain from speaking again, that there was nothing to gain, that it would reopen wounds for him, for the nation, and for me. But it wasn't advice. It was a caution, from someone close to him, someone I once trusted. The words fell like boulders into a stream, one after another, slow and weighty. The room froze. The polished veneer, the legacy's pomp, it all halted. A woman in the third row pressed a hand to her lips. A man near the back bowed his head, visibly shaken. Elizabeth stood motionless. She remained beside the screen, like a lawyer whose case needed no further argument, because the evidence spoke for itself. She let the silence stretch until the last echo of Emily's voice dissipated. Then she spoke, quietly, clearly. This was filmed 90 days ago, not 20 years, not 10. So when we speak of forgiveness, of closure, let's be candid about what's truly demanded. Silence. Still, even to today. She turned slightly toward Bradley, whose eyes had lowered, his stance no longer relaxed but stiff, guarded. The hands that once commanded podiums now clenched subtly at his sides. He said nothing. For the first time that evening, he had no retort prepared. Elizabeth turned back to the crowd, her voice steadier than ever. This isn't about penalizing someone for history. It's about safeguarding those in the present. It's about dismantling the cycle that demands survivors stay mute for the powerful's comfort. Her next words carried no trace of anger, only clarity. This isn't retribution. This is truth, and truth doesn't diminish with time. It doesn't shrink just because someone erected a library around it. No one spoke. No one applauded, because this wasn't a moment for show. It was a confrontation, and for the first time in that pristine, chandelier-lit ballroom, the truth outshone the myth. The silence after Elizabeth's final words was total, but beneath it surged a perilous undercurrent, laden with history, pride, and a frantic need to regain dominance. Bradley stood rigidly at the stage's edge, his charismatic facade now fragile, splintering under a truth he hadn't faced in years, a reality too blunt to deflect with anecdotes. His fingers tightened at his sides, knuckles paling. He cleared his throat, not from need, but from reflex, and approached the microphone. His voice emerged low, almost serene, but a sharp edge of resentment lurked beneath. "You've said much tonight, Congresswoman," he began, summoning the authority of decades behind podiums. "And I commend your zeal, I do. But let's not pretend this is solely about truth." He paused, long enough for tension to ripple through the room, then fixed his gaze on her, like a player declaring check in a game he believed he still commanded. "Because from my perspective, this doesn't resemble justice. It resembles drama, meticulously timed indignation, headlines crafted in advance." His voice grew sharper, not louder, but colder. "You've created a spectacle here, and I'm sure the cameras are thriving on it. But revisiting old scars, spinning them for cheers, doesn't make you bold. It makes you calculated." He gestured to the audience, inviting them to align with him. "You weren't there. You didn't navigate the choices, the pressures, the burden of leadership when the stakes were immense. It's simple to critique when history's already scripted. It's simple to demolish when you don't bear the weight." He faced her again, the air thick with an unspoken charge. What you're doing isn't bravery. It's ambition. The room stirred restlessly. Some shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to applaud, agree, or retreat. Bradley's tone wasn't volatile. It was precise, cutting. But everyone in that ballroom knew what he was attempting. He wasn't merely defending himself, he was reshaping her, trying to reduce her truth to tactics, her outrage to performance, her mission to self-interest. And in that moment, it was clear. The old tools of evasion hadn't vanished. They were merely being refined for one final use. But what Bradley didn't grasp, what he couldn't concede, was that the terrain had already shifted. And Elizabeth Harper was not the woman to let truth be repackaged, sold, and dismissed on his terms. His attempt to cast her as ambitious, to paint her courage as ego, her principles as self-promotion, didn't faze her. Elizabeth didn't flinch, didn't shift her stance, didn't alter her breath. She let Bradley's words hover, like embers from a fire that had long lost its warmth. And then, with the calm precision of someone who'd navigated rooms not built for her, she stepped forward. Her voice was low, but forged with steel, cold, clear, and unassailable. "I don't crave the limelight, Mr. President," she said, each word delivered like a ruling. "I stand here not for attention, but because truth has been starved of air too long. And when someone finally drags it into the light, men like you label it ambition, as if ambition is a sin, but silence is virtuous." She held his gaze, not with hostility, but with something fiercer. Certainty. "If truth unsettles you, that's not my failing. It's your foundation fracturing. If my words sting, perhaps they're slicing through the polished history you've spent years refining." The room fell silent, not from shock, but because it sensed it was witnessing a transformation, a moment impervious to spin or softening. "You had your platform to shape your narrative," she continued. "You had books, speeches, late-night appearances. I'm not here to erase you. I'm here to highlight what was omitted. And if that discomforts people, perhaps we've been too at ease with the wrong priorities." She paused, her breath even, her presence immovable. "You say I'm exploiting history for gain. But here's the reality. You don't dictate what justice looks like just because you weathered the storm. Some of us are still recovering from the deluge." Bradley didn't respond. He couldn't. His usual arsenal, wit, charm, control, carried no weight here. And Elizabeth Harper wasn't performing. She wasn't campaigning. She wasn't chasing power. She was power, honed by truth, standing in a space that had nowhere left to conceal its flaws. The room may have quieted, but beyond those walls, a louder force erupted. A fracture, spreading too swiftly to contain. It began with one post, a blurry screenshot of Elizabeth at the podium, her hand firm, her expression resolute. The words, "If truth unsettles you, that's your foundation fracturing," inscribed in white text below. In 10 minutes, it amassed over 80,000 shares. Within an hour, it topped CNN's homepage. Within 2 hours, it crossed continents, translated by users in London, Paris, and Sydney, captioned simply, "She voiced what we've all thought." But it didn't end there. It couldn't. What Elizabeth unleashed wasn't a moment. It was a dam bursting, and the flood wasn't merely flowing, it was surging. Students at Harvard, Yale, and Howard uploaded videos, some from dorm corridors, others from silent library steps, speaking into their phones with quivering voices. They weren't operatives. They weren't media experts. They were young women raised on sanitized texts and late-night jests, now seeing those narratives bleed truth. "I was 13, watching the scandal on YouTube," one student said, tears streaming. They laughed. The host laughed. My family laughed. And I wondered, Is that what happens when you're hurt? You become a joke. Her video closed with a whisper. Thank you, Elizabeth, before she broke down and stopped recording. On Twitter, hashtags surged, first sporadic, then unified. Truth over power. Break the silence, for her words matter. By midnight, they topped U.S. trends at number 1, number 3 worldwide. Young reporters, long told to remain neutral about the Bradley legacy, began defying protocol. An MSNBC producer tweeted, "My first internship, I was told not to mention Watson. It's irrelevant now. Tonight, I realized why it always mattered." A former volunteer from Bradley's 2008 campaign posted anonymously, "I revered the Bradleys, but I was explicitly told, don't mention Emily if you want to stay." That was the culture, a system built on suppression. More accounts flooded in, and what started as a cultural spark morphed into a historical reckoning. Then came the 44 Collective's statement, a secretive group chat long whispered about among former Bradley White House aides. At 3 a.m., they issued an open letter. For years, we thought silence was professionalism. We now see it was complicity. The letter named no names, but it didn't need to. It recounted moments of coercion, hushed calls, scrapped interviews, barred doors. Some were tasked with discrediting Emily. Others were told to help her move forward. None asked what she wanted. The documents spread like wildfire. By morning, outlets like The Atlantic and The Washington Post confirmed their authenticity. By noon the next day, TikTok became a battleground. Videos wove Elizabeth's speech with reactions from women who'd worked in political offices, corporate firms, even churches. One viral clip showed a middle-aged Latina woman on her porch saying, "I was an intern in '98. My boss told me, 'What happened to Emily won't happen to you if you stay quiet.' That haunted me for 25 years. She wiped her eyes and added, 'I'm ready to speak now.'" The video hit 10 million views in 6 hours. In a Seattle cafe, journalism students huddled, replaying Elizabeth's clip endlessly, murmuring between sips of cold coffee. She did it. She shattered it. They can't silence this now. One pulled out a whiteboard, listing every public figure who'd mocked Emily or stifled her voice. Names appeared in red ink. Some were struck through in blue. Those who'd since apologized. Most weren't. The discussion wasn't just about Bradley anymore. It was about everyone who'd weaponized "move on" as a chain, a gag, a barrier. In Washington, reactions were swift and sharply split. Prominent Democrats issued cautious statements. Some lauded Elizabeth's bold clarity. Others sidestepped with phrases like "stirring old wounds" and "hindering our progress." But even the tamest responses were dissected online, parsed for tone, hesitancy, or strategic ambiguity. People no longer craved neutrality. They demanded truth. They demanded accountability. And above all, they demanded an end to the polished machinery that made silence seem honorable. Amid it all, Elizabeth remained quiet for a time. She didn't post, didn't speak to reporters. When journalists mobbed her car outside her Capitol Hill office the next morning, she strode past without a word, her face inscrutable, her posture unyielding. Some called it aloof, but most called it strength, because for once, the narrative wasn't filtered through commentators or PR teams. The public had reclaimed it, and they carried it forward without her needing to add a word. That afternoon, someone noticed the Bradley Presidential Library website had gone offline briefly. An error read, "Under maintenance." Screenshots spread, sparking a new wave of jests, outrage, and essays across platforms. The symbolism was unmistakable. One tweet nailed it. When truth goes viral, legacy goes dark. By evening, news networks assembled panels. Did Elizabeth Harper redefine political accountability? Can personal ethics be separated from public leadership anymore? Why the Bradley myth may be unraveling. But the most viewed segment wasn't from a major network. It was an independent live stream by 3 college-aged women running a channel called No More Margins. They sat cross-legged in a cramped Brooklyn flat, surrounded by scribbled notes, old clippings, and Emily Watson's TED Talk. One held up a quote from Elizabeth's speech. "Silence isn't peace." She stared into the camera and said, "For years, we were told this story was done, but we never got to say so. Tonight, we decide." The stream crashed twice from traffic. By nightfall, top universities scheduled urgent panels on ethics, politics, and the role of memory in power dynamics. Professors rewrote syllabi. Podcasters dropped emergency episodes. Those who were 13 during the scandal, absorbing its lessons silently, were now 38, finally grasping what was done to them, not just before them. Some were parents now. Some had daughters, ready to speak, to question, to shatter the script. And behind it all, like a steady engine driving forward, Elizabeth Harper's name wasn't just trending. It was reshaping something deeper. How history is narrated, how legacies are protected. Not because she was the loudest, but because she spoke plainly in a space where others were conditioned to murmur. Outside, the world was erupting. But within the ballroom, time seemed to pause, as if history itself held its breath to see if anyone on that stage would dare continue the dialogue Elizabeth had ignited. Elizabeth stood firm, spine straight, the light grazing her face just enough to show she wasn't enraged. She was determined. She scanned the room slowly, not to provoke, not to challenge, but to ensure they listened. Not just those before her, but those behind the podiums, those in the shadows, those who'd learned to thrive by staying quiet, nodding politely, and cheering power because it paid. She lifted the microphone one last time, voice steady, needing no force, only finality. "Let me be explicit," she said, her tone so firm it shook the room more than any shout could. "We're not here to raise monuments. We're not here to rewrite the past." She paused, her breath measured. The crowd sat still, reeling from what had unfolded. She continued, "We're here to strip away the disguises, to peel back the layers of gloss, power, and storytelling that have shielded certain men from the standards they imposed on others." She inhaled, eyes fixing on Bradley, who no longer met her gaze. "This isn't about obliteration. This is about revelation. And revelation," she said, letting the word linger, "is what justice looks like when truth has languished too long in shadow." The entire ballroom, filled with former senators, academics, donors, reporters, seemed to converge into one moment. Phones fell silent. No one stirred. Not a utensil clinked. Not a cough broke the quiet. It was as if the chandeliers themselves were attentive. Then she delivered it, the line that would echo through history. "We didn't come to topple statues," she said softly, firmly, without hesitation. "We came to remove the masks." The silence was immediate, absolute, not reverent, stunned. Every breath seemed to halt because there was no response to that. None prepared, none possible. Not from the Bradley Foundation's PR team, not from the analyst in the back, not from William Bradley himself, whose face now lacked the practiced assurance he'd worn effortlessly for decades. He didn't speak. He didn't look up. And then he moved, slowly, almost mechanically. Bradley stepped back from the lectern. He didn't wait for the next speaker. He didn't deliver the planned closing remarks. There was no call for applause, no nod to the moderators, no attempt to reclaim the space with a final quip or a last wave to history. He simply exited the stage. The audience watched, bewildered, caught between decorum and disbelief. Some began to clap instinctively, from habit, but it faded quickly as they grasped what they were seeing. Bradley didn't look back. His staff followed in silence, their faces a mix of alarm and incredulity. The stage's rear door closed behind him with a soft, decisive thud. Elizabeth stood still. She didn't smile, didn't revel, because this was never about triumph. It was about unveiling, and the room now sat in a rare political moment. Raw truth. No script, no deflection. Just the stark outcome of a question finally answered. The moderator, a nervous figure from a think tank accustomed to tame policy debates, approached the mic, his face ashen, hands trembling slightly. He glanced offstage, hoping for a cue that never came. "We, thank all for a robust and spirited exchange of perspectives," he faltered. "This ends our session on ethical leadership and generational duty." No one clapped. No one stood. The audience rose only when necessary, not from respect, but from the quiet weight of witnessing a seismic shift beneath them. Outside, the press had multiplied. Dozens of microphones and lenses waited like scavengers, but no one appeared. Inside, guests exited slowly, speechless. Some clutched coats like armor. A few muttered to one another, but most kept eyes down. Some from shock, some to avoid being noticed. They'd just seen an untouchable figure become transparent, and they lacked words for what followed. Meanwhile, online, Elizabeth's final line blazed like kindling, captured, translated, scrawled on protest signs. "We didn't come to topple statues. We came to remove the masks." It graced magazine covers, editorial subtitles, the anthem of countless live streams. Young women printed it on tees. Survivors added it to profiles. Writers wove it into essays, and teachers used it as a prompt in ethics classes nationwide. What happens when history is no longer shaped by victors, but questioned by the wronged? That night, The Atlantic ran a headline that encapsulated the moment. "When truth entered, power exited." The New Yorker followed. Elizabeth Harper didn't just speak, she unveiled an era. But perhaps the most poignant image came not from a newsroom, but from a 19-year-old art student in Detroit. She shared a charcoal sketch on Instagram. Bradley's face, half-shadowed, with a hand reaching not to attack, but to peel away a mask of newsprint, laughter, and data. Behind it, nothing. Just a face, weary, aged, human. Beneath, she wrote Elizabeth's words. "We came to remove the masks." It was shared over 3 million times. Elizabeth exited quietly. No press conference, no photo, no celebratory lap. She left through the service door, flanked only by 2 aides, in a silence more potent than cheers. Her expression was unreadable, her stride unhurried. A few reporters spotted her, but held back questions. Even they sensed this story defied soundbites. This wasn't scandal, it was transformation. In the car, her aide murmured, "You've made history." Elizabeth shook her head slightly and whispered, "No." She did. She didn't name her, but all knew. The woman silenced, the women told to look away, the generations who learned silence as survival. They had names now, faces, stories. And tonight, one stood in the spotlight and spoke what none had been granted a stage to say. This wasn't legacy's end. It was the dawn of an unveiling. And no one, not presidents, not commentators, not donors, could halt what followed. But revolutions don't fade when lights dim. And by dawn, the nation no longer debated what Elizabeth said, but whether she'd overstepped by saying it. Morning brought no calm. It brought headlines. They struck like tremors, blaring from newsstands, coursing through cable networks, spreading with each click. On one side, admiration, on the other, outrage. And at the center, Elizabeth Harper, now America's most divisive figure. Did Elizabeth Harper dishonor a president or reshape accountability? asked Politico. The New York Times took a cautious tack. A night that fractured room and nation. Others were blunt. The Daily Wire dubbed her a showman with a grudge. A Fox News host opened with, "Is this respect now?" Treating presidents like felons. Social media became a war zone of fervor and divides. Clips from the night flooded feeds. The most shared, Elizabeth's closing words, "We didn't come to topple statues. We came to remove the mask," fueled over 14 million TikToks, woven into classroom talks, protest clips, and spoken word pieces. Supporters called her the voice of the silenced, a disruptor of political pageantry, a force in stilettos. Critics branded her insolent, scheming, too brash, too swift, too loud. Talk shows didn't hide the rift. An MSNBC segment hailed her the lone voice bold enough to name moral failure's specter. A CNN panel erupted in shouts when a former Bradley aide accused her of breaching sacred political decorum. Sacred, as if silence were ever divine. But Elizabeth stayed silent for now. She observed the chaos from her own quiet edge. Her phone buzzed endlessly. Allies calling, strangers offering protection, speaking in low tones. Networks pleaded for exclusive interviews. A former senator texted, "You torched the right target. Don't let them guilt you for striking the match." But darker messages arrived too. Emails titled, "Stay in line," or "Watch who you defy." One read, "Power has allies." She didn't falter, because Elizabeth knew precisely what she'd done and why. But beyond her silence, the nation's divide deepened. Conservative outlets warned she'd set a precedent that could politicize past administrations. Liberal writers countered that only those profiting from moral immunity were upset. The Chicago Tribune called her speech a vital wound to a history too often penned by its beneficiaries. But the Wall Street Journal's editorial board snapped back. Accountability without restraint becomes theater. At dinner tables, sides were chosen. In classrooms, arguments flared. Some teachers struggled to explain the 1990s impeachment to students, only for students to ask, why didn't anyone explain what it meant for her? Others claimed Elizabeth reopened scars, but students retorted, they never healed, just buried. The tipping point, forcing even neutral institutions to act, came when a major university's ethics department announced a symposium. When deference shields power, the ethics of challenging legacy. It sold out in 43 minutes. In an Atlanta cafe, retired civil rights lawyers gathered for their weekly breakfast. One, a woman who marched in Selma in 1965, watched Elizabeth's speech 3 times. Then, voice-breaking, she said, "We fought to speak, but no one warned how hard it is when you do." Meanwhile, the political machine scrambled. Some Bradley Foundation donors quietly withdrew, seeking distance before recommitting funds. Others rallied, defending William Bradley publicly, citing his lifelong service and the peril of retroactive moral fury. But among younger staff, especially women, support for Elizabeth grew. Some contacted her anonymously. One aide wrote, "She said what I've feared even thinking for years." But the most striking shift came from Congress. A junior representative from Ohio, known for avoiding controversy, issued a letter titled, "Harper didn't divide us. She revealed our existing divide." 9 other first-term lawmakers signed it. By day's end, cable news struggled to keep pace. One pundit, breathless, said, "We're seeing, live, what happens when history is challenged, not with anger, but with truth and a mic." Another countered, "This wasn't courage. It was spectacle posing as justice. She ambushed a president on his stage." But that was the point, wasn't it? It wasn't his stage anymore. It never truly was. It was built on silence, and Elizabeth had pulled the curtain, yet pressure on her mounted. In a private meeting, a senior DNC strategist warned her team, "Donors are uneasy. There's backlash. Some things are best left untouched." Elizabeth's reply, per an attendee, was stark. So was slavery. The quote leaked, fueling the firestorm. Protesters gathered outside the Capitol. One group waved signs, respect over rage, and not her time. Across from them, another chanted, name her truth. Speak her name. Silence serves the comfortable. She didn't break the system. She exposed it. In homes, on screens, in airports, everywhere, people didn't just discuss politics. They debated power, truth, what it meant to hear someone voice what many had whispered for years, decades, lifetimes. For some, it was freedom. For others, a threat. But for all, it was undeniable. Yet through it all, Elizabeth defied expectations. No apologies, no gloating, no TV spots to soften the impact. She kept working on the Hill, in her district, in private meetings, where policy was crafted and fights still raged. Because she knew her actions weren't a stunt. They weren't a dramatic flourish. They were a mirror to a nation. And people don't always like mirrors, not when they reflect what was tolerated too long. So the nation stayed divided, not over Elizabeth, but over what she made them face. And deep down, even her harshest critics knew the old order had been pierced, and it wouldn't revert. While the nation clashed over Elizabeth's truth, a heavier silence spread, quieter, weightier, from a man who once dominated every space he entered. For the first time in over 30 years, William Bradley vanished. No interviews, no speeches, no book tours. The man who was once any room's focal point, the eloquent charmer, the comeback master, the narrative weaver, faded like a specter. His team released no statement, only a brief note on the Bradley Foundation's site. Due to recent events, President Bradley will reduce public engagements in the coming weeks to focus on personal matters and family. No elaboration, no details, but all knew what transpired because retreat doesn't need announcing when the world sees you waver. The silence was tactical, perhaps essential, but deafening. Cable anchors, who once built segments around him, had only clips and guesses. Is this a brief pause? One asked. Or an era's end? Another said plainly, he built his own legend. Elizabeth dismantled its framework. Initially, his absence sowed confusion. A planned keynote at the Global Leadership Summit, canceled. A panel at the Aspen Institute, quietly dropped. A primetime CNN cameo on 21st century leadership, swapped last minute for a former diplomat. Even the Bradley Foundation's gala, typically a star-studded affair, was rebranded press-free. A reporter trying to enter was told, "We're keeping it understated this year." Understated, a term never linked to the Bradley name. Yet there he was, or wasn't. Some called it prudent, saying the storm would pass, that focus would shift to elections or the next big scandal. But others, especially his longtime defenders, showed faltering confidence. If you're innocent, a Boston Globe op-ed read, "Why flee the stage you once owned?" Images of Bradley surfaced, none official. One caught him leaving a Concord townhouse, head lowered, cap pulled low, sunglasses on despite cloudy skies. Another, more poignant, showed him alone in a Portsmouth cafe, gazing out a window, a cold coffee untouched before him. The man who once faced hundreds of reporters now sat unnoticed by a generation too young to care or too aware to pretend. His defenders began to splinter. Loyalists, who stood by him through impeachment, scandals, and war rooms, issued guarded statements. One former cabinet member said, "We must grant space for introspection, even for those who led." Another was blunter. "Legacy isn't a free pass." The Bradley Foundation's board issued a brief note, praising his service, while stressing truth and openness as core to any trusted institution. It was a subtle way to say, "We're unsure if we still back you." While Bradley stayed silent, the world didn't. Elizabeth Harper's speech entered communication curricula. Her confrontation reached legal ethics courses. A San Francisco theater group staged a reenactment called The Veil. Its final line wasn't shouted. It was whispered to a silent room. "We didn't come to topple statues. We came to remove the masks." Audiences left weeping or uneasy, but none unmoved. In New York, rumors spread of Bradley scrapping a planned memoir sequel. Ghostwriters had been hired, cover designs pitched, but calls ceased. Deadlines vanished. One publisher anonymously said, "He's lost the final say. Someone else claimed it." In Bradley's inner circle, tensions simmered. Some staff felt betrayed, angry he didn't fight back harder. One insider reportedly said, "This man survived impeachment. Will one woman's speech undo it all?" Another replied, "It wasn't one woman. It was a nation seeing what it hadn't before." The rift in Bradley's circle mirrored America's own. And through it all, Bradley stayed invisible. His voice, once omnipresent, soothing, convincing, was absent from talk shows, op-eds, fundraising circuits. No sharp rebuttal, no deft pivot, just absence. It was as if, for the first time, he had nothing to say. For Elizabeth, the silence wasn't victory. It was outcome. Outcomes weren't gratifying. They were inevitable. "People ask how I feel now that he's quiet," she told a confidant. "But it's not about his silence. It's that it took this long." She paused, then added, "Silence can be strength, but silence after truth, that's not power. That's capitulation." Beyond politics, the symbolism resonated. Cartoons depicted statues with faces stripped. Editorials cast Bradley not as the comeback kid, but as a symbol of a generation that mistook charm for accountability. His supporters persisted, but their voices softened. The narrative had shifted, not abruptly, not loudly, but irrevocably. Asked about his withdrawal, a PBS NewsHour journalist said, "This isn't cancellation. It's consequence." And for perhaps the first time, William Bradley lives where his words can't outrun truth. But as Bradley retreated to shadows, power, as always when challenged, didn't vanish. It regrouped, and now it called Elizabeth to answer for the blaze she'd ignited. The summons arrived in a thick, formal envelope, delivered not by email or aid, but by a congressional courier. A dated gesture meant to intimidate. Elizabeth opened it at her desk, aides nearby, used to high stakes and viral moments, but even they hushed as her eyes scanned the page. It wasn't an invitation, it was a mandate. The House Ethics Committee was holding an urgent hearing, officially to assess evolving standards for moral leadership and former officials' public roles. Unofficially, it targeted her. The letter was courteous, sterile, and laced with veiled restraint. She had posed vital questions, it said, and challenged a president in a way that warrants institutional review. Elizabeth read it twice. It meant, "You've unsettled too many. Now we'll contain you." She had 7 days to prepare. 7 days of quieter congressional halls when she passed. 7 days of sidelong glances, half smiles from allies who once championed her, now whispering in elevators. She pushed too far. It didn't need to be so personal. You can't shame a former president without repercussions. The establishment had rallied, and this hearing wasn't about truth. It was about control. On the hearing's morning, Elizabeth entered the Hart Building's long corridor, her heels clicking like a drumbeat of judgment. The marble felt colder than usual. Reporters lined the halls, cameras flashing like salvos, asking questions for headlines, not answers. "Congresswoman, do you regret your words? Are you ready for censure? Some say you've weakened the institution. Your response?" She didn't reply. Not yet, knowing this wasn't the place for quips. It was where narratives were etched or erased. Inside, The chamber hummed with brittle tension. The committee sat behind a broad bench, 12 members, 8 men, 4 women, in perfect alignment. Faces schooled into impartiality. The chair, a seasoned lawmaker known for deals over ideals, adjusted his glasses and spoke. "Congresswoman Harper, we thank you for attending. We value your participation in this critical dialogue." Elizabeth sat alone at the witness table. No lawyer, no staff, just a binder, a glass of water, and unteachable resolve. She leaned to the mic, voice calm, deliberate. "I'm here because you asked about ethics for former leaders in public life. But let's be frank about this. This isn't about their boundaries. It's about mine." Pens paused. A murmur rippled behind the press. She continued. "What you call dialogue began because I questioned letting men with unaddressed abuses of power return to public stages without scrutiny. That shouldn't be contentious. It should be mandatory." The chair raised a hand. "Let's focus on institutional standards, Congresswoman," she interjected, politely but precisely. "Standards are my point. The standard of legacy trumping truth, of charm erasing consequence, of shielding power at the cost of those it crushed." The room tensed. Then came questions, polished, subtly aggressive, meant to trap without seeming harsh. "Do your remarks risk bipartisan collaboration? Is there a line between accountability and public humiliation? Is it proper for a congresswoman to confront a former president at a non-profit event?" Elizabeth answered each with a surgeon's precision and a storm's force. "Collaboration doesn't demand silence. Humiliation isn't imposed, it's earned. And yes, it's proper. Because if ethics are off limits at a leadership summit, what are we leading?" Some members averted eyes. Others stiffened. One senior member muttered to an aide, clearly irked. But Elizabeth didn't yield. She leaned forward slightly, not to defy, but to clarify. "You want an ethics debate? Start with the ethics of memory, of silence, of celebrating someone who harmed others for what he built, while those harmed are erased for what they endured." A younger member, uneasy, tried to shift. "Congresswoman, don't you believe in redemption?" Her reply was swift. "I believe in redemption, but not without contrition, not without truth, and not when the system punishes the truth-teller harsher than the one who sparked the fire." The hearing aimed to confine her. Instead, it exposed the barriers. By the second hour's end, the room's energy had shifted. Some members sat back, impassive. Others wrote frantically, trying to regain control through words. But Elizabeth had redrawn the lines. She'd turned a room meant to discipline her into a confessional for a nation wary of its myths. As the chair tried to close with a neutral summary, Elizabeth spoke again, softly. "Frame this however you wish. File it. Call it unprecedented. Dismiss it as drama. But know this. Silence isn't bipartisan anymore, nor is memory. The public sees, and they know, discomfort from injustice." The room froze, then the gavel fell, not with closure, but exhaustion. Outside, reporters swarmed again, but now they chased a moment, not scandal. And Elizabeth walked through them with her earlier calm, because nothing was taken from her. They tried to bury her with process, and she used it to unearth truth. As Elizabeth left the chamber, her action's weight wasn't just political, it was personal. And what lingered wasn't noise or headlines, but one relentless question. What's the cost of truth when power teaches survival through silence? The lesson wasn't about politics. It wasn't even about Bradley. It was about systems enduring by training good people to believe morality is risky only when voiced. Elizabeth Harper didn't topple an institution. She dared to expose what festered beneath its gleaming surface, and for that, she was tested, discredited, nearly broken. But by refusing to apologize for unease, she did what few dare. She showed the nation that silence isn't healing, and legacy isn't virtue. True leadership doesn't hide in nostalgia. It faces truth, even when the room isn't ready. We're taught power earns absolution, that influence buys leniency, that a man's rise shields him from the pain he leaves. But Elizabeth's story ripped that narrative apart. She didn't shout, didn't slander. She stood, and that was the revolt. In a nation still wary of facing its celebrated monsters, she proved unmasking isn't destruction. It's liberation for the victims we recall and the history we're writing. Thank you for staying until now and joining us in this pursuit of justice. Your support is everything. Like, subscribe, and enable notifications to stay updated. We'd love your thoughts. Comment below and share what stirred you most in this story. Together, our voices matter.